Now that we've successfully created the pivot table, we are going to try to summarize the data to build a report from our current data set. Now, a brief walkthrough on the different fields you're seeing here. So this sidebar is where we're going to do most of the work. And the first part of this sidebar that we see, this top part, just lists out all the field names that exist on your data set. So the field names that are listed out here just simply correspond to the headings of your data set. And then we have a box here that is, that is designated filters. Now this is where you're going to drag in the field names that you want to use as filter criteria, right? And then we have a field or a space here, an area here dedicated for columns, where you're going to whatever you place in here is going to serve as the column names for your report. Then we have the parts here, the area here designated rows. So whatever you drag in here is going to serve as the rows. Basically, the value of the field, the possible value of the field that you drag in here will serve as the rows. And then we have values. Now, the values area are reserved for computed values. So we're going to see how that works in a second. So first of all, to get started with building a report with pivot tables, we can select the field names that we want to see. So for instance, we can select the commodity and then the amount. So you can immediately see that just by selecting those first two, we have, an automated table that has been generated here that just shows what the different commodities and then the sum of the amount of those commodities. And then we have a grand total row. If we come back here to where our pivot table field sidebar is, you can see that the commodity that we selected was automatically added to rows. Okay, and then amount was added to values. Now, whatever is added to values is usually computed. If we added another data, so for instance, we selected PHC name, you can see that now by default, the PHC name has just been added to values and it's saying count of PHC name. So this is just showing the number of PHC names that we have that's in our data set. But this might not be a very meaningful data to have, so we would probably want to use the PHC name as a filter. What I did was I just clicked on the PHC name and I dragged it into the filters area, and immediately you would notice that there is another row that has been added up top that particular table. And what you can do is you can click on the drop down arrow on that particular field and then use it as a filter for the current table that is shown here. So for instance, if we wanted to see number of family planning commodities that have been used in a particular PHC, we can just click first to deselect all and then select. So for instance, like PHC Apata, if we select that now, we can see the data for just that particular PHC. So we can see the data here show up for just that particular PHC, and we can do the same, with gearing, Genta, as we keep selecting. So basically the PHC name is now acting as a filter for our pivot table. Alternatively, I'm going to click clear filter now, just to clear the filter that we've added, and just select all. So alternatively, instead of using the PHC name as a filter, we can decide to filter by commodity. If we decide to filter by commodity, we will drag the commodity to the PHC name. And right now, you see the only thing inside values is the sum of amounts. So what you have here is the grand total of all the values in the amount column. That is what you have here. So I said earlier that whatever field name you place into values becomes a computed value, right? And the default computed value depends on the data type of the particular field that you are dragging into the values area. For instance, amount, this particular field contains numbers, and so when dragged into the values area, the default computation that is done on the amount is a sum. Now we notice also that when we dragged the commodity down here, we can see that the commodity here is text. And so what Excel does is Excel automatically, instead of doing a sum, because you cannot sum text, so instead of doing a sum of this, it does a count of the occurrence, right, of the text that we have in commodity. And that's why this became what? Count of commodity. Now the cool part with this is, so if we take this down to, let's just take this to rows first. So we have on the rows, we have commodities, and then for our filter we have PHC name, and then for values we have the sum of amount. We can decide that instead of showing the sum of amount, we want this to show the percentage of each of these commodities that have been used over the last 6 months in Riom local government. So if we want this to display as percentages instead of just amounts, what we can simply do is right click. So we can click anywhere, right? Click anywhere in this column and right click, select the value field settings. So once we click on the value field settings, we have this dialog box that pops up, and then from this dialog box that pops up for the particular pivot table field that we've selected, we can adjust how we want Excel to, summarize that particular field. So we can see here that by default, sum is already selected. We can change it to count. We can use average. We can use max, mean, product, count numbers, and even standard deviation. In the same vein, if we select the next part of this segment that says show data as, we can click this drop down and select different ways in which we can show that particular data. So we can select it to show percentage of grand total. Okay, so if we select percentage of grand total and then click OK, this now represents our amount as a percentage. It represents each commodity now as a percentage of the overall number of commodities that have been added. So there is no limit to how much we can choose to visualize that data. That is what makes pivot tables very powerful. We've just seen firsthand how we can format pivot table fields. Let's explore it further. At this stage, the best label to give to this would no longer just be sum of amount, because this is no longer sum of amount, as we've changed the display to be rather to be a percentage. Okay, so to edit this, we can just simply double click on that particular field and then change the field name to say percentage of total, you know, to better capture what this particular data set is saying. With the same thing, we can also change the row labels to be commodities instead. With this, we have generated a pivot table that tells us the percentage of, what percentage of the total is each of the commodities that has been, used or deployed over the last 6 months in Riom local government. And we've also created a filter that can help us see, what that percentage looks like for each local, to see what that percentage looks like for each PHC, by simply just toggling on or off any of the PHCs that we intend to find out that data for. So we are going to leave this pivot table, and then we're going to create another pivot table for the next thing we're going to explore. So once again, to add another pivot table, we simply just click in our table, right, our data set, and then click on insert, then click on pivot table. We would still be asked the same thing. Our data range our table has already been selected. The next thing is we want to create a pivot table, we want to place it on our existing worksheets. So I click on existing worksheet and I put my cursor on the table range field. I'll move this a bit and click and drag on the area here to insert another pivot table. So once that has been populated, I can click OK, and then we have a new pivot table that has been inserted. So this time around, instead of having, just a single arrangement like this, we can actually have a 2-dimensional table using pivot tables. So for instance, if we select the fields that we want to see, so let's say we want to see commodity, right? So don't worry about where it's placed for now, just select the fields you want to summarize. So we select the amount, and then we select the PHC name. And now to achieve a 2-dimensional table, we want the amount to remain in values, but we want the PHC name, we don't want it to be count of PHC name, so we want the PHC name to be under rows. Now when that happens, if you take a look at the table that has generated now, it has generated a 2-dimensional table where we have, the commodity, right? The commodity becomes the heading for, that's a kind of row heading, and then the PHCs, fall under each of those headings. Now, a better arrangement for this would most likely be having the PHC names as the headings and then the commodities under them, but it all still depends on what your requirements are. To switch the arrangements and have the PHC name as the row headings, what we simply do is we come over here to the row areas, that's the rows area, and then we right click on the PHC name and select move up. Once we've done that, you can see that our table has been adjusted to suit the data. So it's very important to note that the very first field name, right, that is highlighted here would always, that's in the case of a 2-dimensional table, would always act as the row heading. So from this data set, we can easily tell the total number of commodities that have been deployed in each PHC just by arranging our data as a 2-dimensional table, and just looking at it. Finally, we are going to add one more thing to our pivot tables. Now, our pivot table can help us visualize this data a lot better using what we call a pivot chart. To create a pivot chart, you just select any part of your pivot table, and then on the pivot table analyze ribbon, you locate the pivot chart button and just click on that button. So once we click on that, you see here that a chart has been created for our 2D pivot table, right? So what we have here is a 2D pivot table, and what has been generated here is a chart for our 2D table. So you can see here that the data is structured such that for each PHC we have corresponding commodities on the horizontal axis, while on the vertical axis we have the corresponding amount of commodities. Just like we did in charts, you can edit the charts information here. First, the chart title by simply just double clicking in the pivot chart title. You can say chart showing the amount, or we can just call this chart showing the chart showing the number of commodities per PHC. With that, we can see so far we have learned how to first create a table, convert the table to a pivot table, manipulate the different options on the pivot table to achieve a particular report by adjusting the pivot table fields, create a 2D table, and also create a pivot chart from our 2D table. Now, this and many more you can do by combining the different formatting options and customization options that pivot table allows you. In the next module, we are going to be looking at formulas and how we can do better manipulation of our data set using formulas. See you in the next one.